Good afternoon and welcome to the Preservation Association of Lincoln Brown Bag Lecture Series. My name is Eileen Burkton. I'm the coordinator of these brown bags. If you are interested in these programs, please join our membership. You can join by going to preservelincoln.org. Today is the 15th of a series of lectures with Jim McKee. Support for this series is provided by Speedway Properties. Please join me in thanking Speedway Properties for their generous support of the videotaping and other expenses associated with this series. Our speaker today is Jim McKee. Jim is a lifelong Lincolnite. His great-grandparents pioneered in Lancaster counties in the 1870s. Jim has a bachelor's degree from UNL and operates J. and L. Lee Company. Jim has written over 1,000 articles and books on Lincoln and Nebraska history. Jim is on the Nebraska State Historical Society Board of Trustees and also serves on the City of Lincoln Historic Preservation Commission. He is also a founding member of the Preservation Association of Lincoln. This is the 15th of a series of over 25 talks during the next couple of years. The series is titled Jim McKee's Complete History of Lincoln, and this is program number 15. Jim invites you to ask questions during the program. Please join me in welcoming Jim McKee.
Well, in our chronological journey, we are up to roughly 1880. Okay. Mr. Boles' birth year. Okay. The building pictured is Herpolsheimer's department store. Henry Herpolsheimer himself came to Lincoln in 1880, hence the 1880 reference. And he started his store along Howe Street at 1109, which was a sort of a spawning place for a lot of other department stores through the years. And within a year, he claimed to have an inventory of $108,000 and 12 clerks, which meant that he was quite prosperous at the time. He then purchased the property on the southwest corner of 12th and N and opened the store there in 1890. He claims it was 3 stories tall. I'm not sure where the third story exactly comes in, but it did have a complete full basement. It had 2 elevators, and interestingly also operated its own electric light plant. Probably this was a direct current electric light plant because one of the major things he did was operate his elevators, and elevator motors love direct current. However, also he had considerable electric lights in the building, giving it the moniker or the nickname of the daylight store, partially because of the number of windows and partially because he illuminated it with electric lights, which in 1890 was the very cutting edge, but you had to have your own electric light plant at that point in time. He also had a 34-station cash point system, which most of us remember most generally with Miller and Payne's, where you would put the cash that you received from a customer in a little cylinder about 10 inches long and so round, and it would zip off to the office, which meant that there were 34 places within the store which you could purchase something, but they didn't have to have a cash register. And this was a twofold advantage. One, you didn't have each one of the clerks making change, perhaps erroneously, and it meant they only had to have a cash fund in one place in the store. One of the last places that I remember in Lincoln that had this was the old Wells and Frost store in Omaha. And they didn't have the pneumatic tubes. They had the flyer system, which was a wire basket on a wire which went up to the balcony. Put your money in it, pull a spring-loaded arm, and it shot that basket up to the top. As far as I know, Miller and Payne still has the wiring, if you will, or the pneumatic tubes in the old building at 13th and O, where they had their pneumatic cash system. But he had it long before they did. So known not only as the daylight store, but also as the glass block. In 1903, they will add another small building to the right, which would be to the west, which will come right up to the alley. By 1923, he advertised that he had over 200 employees working in this building. However, the Great Depression did him in. 1931 in May, the building did close. Their Herpolsheimer name lives on in a car dealership in Seward, as far as I know, still going. This was the cafeteria within the building, and they had a department for practically anything, including a number of proprietary departments. For example, you could buy china in their china department, which was stamped as Herpolsheimer. So if you like to go to antique stores or antique malls, you're going to find glassware and china, which bears the name Herpolsheimer on it. It wasn't made there, but it was made for Herpolsheimers. When they tore the building down, initially they left the basement, and the Firestone store was built on top of it. Also, the alley, or the south wall of the original building, all 3 stories of it, and the west wall were left intact, and they became the 2 walls on the backside of the Firestone building. They also, as I said, left the entire basement, which became an underground parking lot. Then, in 1998, they excavated it, tore out the parking lot, tore down the 2 remaining walls, so many of us remember those 2 walls remaining, and the basement, which was a parking garage. They tore it out, filled it in, and built a new parking lot, Firestone building, which sits on top of it. This is looking across the excavation towards the northeast, and we can see the walls of the old basement are still there. But these will be filled in, and of course now architects love a clean hole. They don't like to leave anything there. So archaeologists are going to frown on it, but architects love it. And I'm sure those walls were torn out at the same time.
What year was it torn down?
1998 was the last part of the building to go. Before that, I'm guessing it was in the late 40s, early 50s. The county jail, not known to many of us. This was built in 1873 in a rather interesting sort of castle-like structure, which stood on the northwest corner of the block given to the county for its courthouse by the Capital Commission in 1867. We'll see the rest of this in a minute and see an aerial view of this building where it sat on the block. So we're looking in this picture probably towards the southeast. This building pretty much faced towards the north on that corner. It was built in 1873, long before there was a county courthouse. Up until that time, the courthouses, we'll see, moved around between private properties through the city. Architect was a man by the name of L.W. Foster, who I don't run across very often in the city of Lincoln. There were 6 cells in the building. This is an interior. Facing what direction, I have no idea. The cell doors were purchased by Bob Hans, who put them on his wine cellar when this building was ultimately torn down. He said it took him over a full day to remove them, so they were pretty well in there. I don't know, these 6 guys don't look too tough to me. John and I decided we could probably take them. Or John could, and I would cheer him on. This is the building in later years. The crenellations are removed, they've plastered over it, and it becomes kind of a humdrum-looking building that you probably could have easily, and probably did, drive by and not even see it there. You can see it's the same building, and that's just about it. Lancaster County itself will come about in 1859 when the county, such as it was, ordered an election to be held at Mr. Shirley's house. And Mr. Shirley's house was on Stevens Creek someplace. We don't know exactly where. 1860, that first election was actually held after being called in the previous year. And that year, 23 votes were cast in the county, so not too many people lived here. At that point in time, Simon Benedum's log cabin, cottonwood house, they called it sometimes, on the northwest corner of 9th and Q, was serving as a county courthouse. They also used Sweet and Brock's Bank, which was on the northeast corner of 10th and O Streets, where now the Clayton House, which is no longer called the Clayton House, but the building still sat. They particularly used the building on the northeast corner of that intersection as the county treasurer's office. In 1871, so just a year later than we were talking about a minute ago, the citizens petitioned the county to issue $50,000 worth of bonds. I can't remember a time in my lifetime that we've ever had to petition the county to issue bonds or ask them to spend our money, but they did. We asked them to create bonds to build a courthouse. 1871, nothing happened. They didn't do it, and in 1882, they finally issued a $5 million, 5-year county levy to build a courthouse. Nothing happened. Finally, in 1887, a bond issue for $200,000 was built. You can see we could have saved money had we acted sooner, perhaps. Hired an Omaha architect by the name of F.M. Ellis and a Lincoln contractor, W.H.B. Stout, who built many things in the city of Lincoln. are finally hired to build the building. We had another architect involved, fired him, didn't like his plan, so it's kind of struggling along in those periods. But finally, the jail now is going to be sitting clear on the right-hand side in this picture. The building itself will come about after the county commissioners take a junket through the Midwest to look at other county courthouses to see what we wanted. And one of the things they knew they wanted was a building which would, as near as possible, be fireproof. So the building was constructed on a square block of land given to the county or set aside by the Capital Commission in 1867. It's made of Berea, Ohio limestone or sandstone, rock-faced, 150 by 100, so a pretty good size building. The inner walls were made of brick so that it would be fireproof. The roof was made of slate so that it would be fireproof. The floors inside were made of tile so that it would be fireproof, and they claimed the only wood they really used in any excess was window frames, door frames, and doors. However, as you notice the number of chimneys, the building did not have central heating because, of course, the heating plant owned by the city had not yet been built to the block to the northwest. So there were 20 flues in the building, just like houses. If you wanted to heat the building, you had to be on or near a fireplace. Cupola on top, however, is made of wood. We can see here virtually the only interior picture I have as it looked, as I remember it. Everything painted over. The other thing I remember was that going into the county treasurer's office, I think it was, to get license plates or something. Of course, I would have been a child at the time. But the fireplace in there had been covered over with plywood, which had been painted blue. It was really not very attractive. Originally up on top of the building was to be a statue of Justice and a clock affixed in that cupola, which never came about. Instead, they erected a 16-foot tall figure of Abraham Lincoln, which was a steel frame, 16-foot tall, surrounded by 20-gauge copper, which was hammered into his likeness by a Lincoln tinsmith. Originally, the plans called for bronze, but they used copper. Also, 4 eagles, you can see, surmounting the upper part of the cupola. By 1933, the county realized that the upper part of the cupola was made of wood and had badly deteriorated, and you can see if you look at the round window on the left-hand side directly under the eagle, it has been knocked out. So pigeons were roosting inside the cupola, and it was deemed unnecessary to remove it. And in this picture, which is part of a much larger picture, which I own, someone had told me, I wish I knew who it was, that this was a figure of Abraham Lincoln emancipating the slaves, and he's standing there next to 2 slaves. But actually, as we blow the picture up, as we see it here, those are not 2 slaves being emancipated. They are 2 men who have climbed up on the building to have their picture taken, which was a pretty gutsy thing to get up there in the first place. But you can see now that they are probably roughly 6 feet tall, showing that the statue did end up being 16 foot tall. Well, when they got up there and they're going to remove the cupola, being made of wood and deteriorating, they decided that what they were going to do before they got up there and inspected it was remove the statue of Lincoln and put a concrete pedestal on the county grounds, and then that they would re-erect the statue there. But as they got up there, they realized that not just the wood was deteriorating, but the steel framework within him had completely rusted out, and that Howard Cather Construction Company, who was hired as a CWA, which was part of the WPA grant to remove it, he got $3,500 for removing the whole scheme up there. He discovered that the coattails of Abraham Lincoln were held on with baling wire, and that one arm had a 2x4 inserted to hold it together, which of course you couldn't see from the ground. But the result was that it was deteriorating so rapidly in every regard that there was really nothing to establish as a statue on the grounds. So what they did instead was they laid him on the ground outside the Capitol or the courthouse for a number of weeks, apparently, so that people could come up, have their pictures taken beside him. and then they sold him for scrap metal. So he's gone, and the building, of course, is as well gone. This is a picture which is an aerial view, and it shows the new county city building, not the part we're standing in, but the central part, which faced on J Street and accommodated the block to the left or to the north. And that is the original block given to the county by the Capital Commission in 1867. And we can see the county city building. To its left in this picture, we can see the old county courthouse. And then on the corner, we can see the little jail, so that you can now see in your mind where it sat and faced probably towards the north. Practically all of the buildings around this now, if not all of them in this picture, have been torn down, either for new office buildings or for our favorite use, of course, parking lots. The Elks Club building, not particularly a great architectural feature in the city of Lincoln, but it stood on the northwest corner of 13th and P Streets. And as a kid, I thought it was probably originally a house, but it was not. This is a design which the Elks Club used in smaller or larger designs, but literally the same design all over the Midwest. And there's one in a small town in Nebraska, name of which I've forgotten, but looks like this building, probably about 50% of this size. So this was an Elks Club design. What was called the BPOE, the Benevolent Protective Order of Elks, was the 80th Lodge in Nebraska, and originated March 10 of 1888 with 65 charter members. They met first, as many lodges did, in rented quarters, and then built this building, 13th and P, about 1890. The building, when they built their new building, which is now the museum building of the State Historical Society, when they built that building, they sold this building to Hovell & Swanson's, the department store. Hovell & Swanson's took advantage of the building for storage primarily. In the meantime, the Elks had built on over the porch, so the building is virtually the same footprint, but the porch enclosed on the south end of the building. We're looking towards the northwest in this picture, the Nebraska Buick building on the right. The Elks moved from the new building, when they sold that building to the State Historical Society, to their present building, which is hard to tell you where it's located. It is on South 58th Street in that industrial park out there. And I was amazed to learn that they're still there after they moved from downtown. And of course, they built their new building really at the best of times and the worst of times, because what was happening was downtown Lincoln as a retail center was disappearing. And a lot of the people who ate lunch every day at the Elks Club or came to it were moving out. So in selling the building, they moved out to South 58th Street. And for a while, they were having meals only on football game Saturdays. And whether they still do or not, I don't know. But I'm going to guess they probably don't have much more, if as many as the 65 charter members that they started with today. It, like many lodges, is just simply fading away. But they are still there, because I found them in the phone book. Then this, of course, building was torn down, and the Douglas II Theater was built in there, which is now the office building for the Douglas Corporation. And they've left, I guess, pretty much the seats up there because they were poured concrete. And I read that they're going to use that building for now something else, but I'm not sure what it is. One of my favorite pictures, actually, this is part of Lincoln Picturesque. There you are, Matt. Was that 1892, 1893, roughly, these pictures were taken. And this picture is taken from the street level, looking towards the northeast, at the northeast corner of what would be 12th and P Streets. The building on the corner, we'll go ahead and I'll show it to you and then come back to this one, was called the McBride Block, and had a number of uses through the years. The last one I remember was Chris Beck's Tire Store, and small buildings around it. It was torn down to make way for a street-level parking lot, and later became a Swanson Russell building, which I'll point out as we go, at least verbally, because I don't have a slide of it for it to show you. But the building on the right is the one we want to look at briefly, because it is still standing. And this is the story of that building. It was built by a man by the name of Henry Gurner. His father ran a steamship company, so Henry was actually born on board the steamship in 1840, headed for the United States. The family came to the East Coast, where Henry attended school later. He moved to London, and then 1859, 1860, the family moved to Wisconsin. And then in 1872, so Lincoln was very young, Henry moved to the city of Lincoln. His first business was that as a general agent for the Massachusetts Life Insurance Company of Chicago. And his office was in the Sweet and Brock Bank building, which we talked about some weeks ago, on the northeast corner of 10th and O Streets. He then moved to the Commercial Hotel at 11th and P Streets, which is the site today of the Capitol Hotel. Partnered in 1884 with another man as an insurance agent, and then finally is going to purchase the lots on Block 37. On our left would be 12th Street, on our right would be 13th Street. We're in the middle of P Street looking towards the north. He will build the 2-story townhouse, which he called La Gurner Place, L-A space Gurner Place. And it had a skylight basement, if you will, so it was really a 3-story building. Walk under to the low level, had 3 addresses, 1218, 1220, and 1222. Each one of those addresses led to one floor in the building. Mr. Gurner lived at 1222, which was the furthest to the right, and I think the basement, but we really can't tell. But each one of the 3 apartments, if you will, had an entire floor. In 1889, an insurance magazine noted that he was about to start a new insurance company in Lincoln with a capitalization of $100,000, but nothing happened. Then in 1893, he sold his insurance agency, but still is listed as residing at this building. 1895, he became rather famous for 2 things. He was in 2 large lawsuits. One of them was that he had purchased shares from the Capital National Bank. And he had bought 50 shares of stock and paid $6,230 for it, which is a very large and interesting question we won't get into today. But the bank did not fail. It went under, and he sued to get his money back, which is kind of an interesting thing to do. The bank went under, but he sued to get his money back. Did not get it as far as we could tell. And he also was sued himself by Edward Church and Henry Oliver, who owned the Oliver Theater, which preceded the Varsity Theater. I think we might have talked about that last time. Gurner had pledged some money to them in helping to rebuild the building, but they claimed he did not perform his $200, and he claimed that they didn't do the remodeling that they said they were going to. So, Mr. Gurner. He disappeared a few years later from Lincoln, neither winning nor losing either lawsuit as near as I can tell. Then in 1891, flipped to a different subject, 22 farmers in the Lincoln area established what they called Farmers Mutual Insurance Company. Their plan was simply to insure farmland and farm buildings, as well as churches, schools out in the countryside. By 1898, that firm existed and it expanded into South Dakota and purchased Mr. Gurner's building. Completely renovated the facade and the interior as we see it today, literally. Then in the 1950s, Lincoln was the home of around 33 insurance companies. Became known as the Hartford of the West briefly, and Farmers Mutual was noted as being instrumental in the fact that 55 of Nebraska's 93 counties were rural fire protected by insurance. About 1963, Farmers Mutual will buy that property, sell this property, and they will begin building over at 12th and J Street, their new building, which faces the mall towards the, at that time, south. And 1222 will be purchased by the Nebraska National Life Insurance Company. By 2009, Farmers Mutual had acquired that entire block and built their new building over on 13th Street. Between J and K, and they retained the old building, which they are remodeling and hope to lease it out to the state of Nebraska. That's a $15 million building that they built, and it's a really spiffy building with a little grass turf up on top, and nice. By that time, 2009, Farmers Mutual was noted as being in the top 10 mutual insurance companies in the United States. Exactly what that means, I'm not sure. Whether it's top 10 in terms of number of insurance or what, I don't know. Then the next phase occurs around Ayers Swanson advertising, which was developed by Joyce Ayers and Gus Swanson in 1950. Then it became ultimately Swanson, Sinke, Ellis. They officed in the First Federal Trust Building on 13th and N Street. They bought the building ultimately and remodeled it again. 1979, that became Swanson, Rollheiser, Holland. And like a law firm, it just sort of keeps adding names and changing their existence, but it's still the same firm. They will then purchase the building to the left, tear it down, make a ground floor parking lot, and ultimately we'll build a new building there, which ties in to the old Gerner Place building, which, as I said, is still there with a new front on it. Not much is visible on the exterior. If anything of the original part, you can easily see in that building at 1222P, the 3 doors. The middle door is the one that is still a door. The 2 on the side, you'll notice, have been stoned in, but they are still there clearly, one going down and one going up. The middle door would lead to the principal floor, but they now use it only as an emergency exit, so although it appears to be a door, it really isn't used that way. However, if you go inside the building, you can find, for example, on the second floor, of Lagerner Place, towards the west wall is a fireplace, which existed at least as a fireplace, which has been remodeled, but the fireplace is still there. The one below it has been blocked off, and my understanding is they're about to remodel the building again inside, and that fireplace will disappear. And the only thing that will leave then of the original building are basement walls, which are primarily on the east side of the building in the basement. But as the insurance company purchased the property, they begin to add vaults, primarily fireproof, but vaults for insurance policies and other paper products, and they're scattered all throughout the building. And so far, all of the vault doors are still there. They just left them in place because it's more expensive to remove them than leave them, and they just use them for storage. So that's your homework. Go look at 1222P on your way home. And we saw that one. That's the building that became the parking lot. The Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad. We're standing in O Street and we're looking towards the north here. In 1887, the Chicago, Rock Island, Pacific, we'll call it the Rock Island from here on, was the last major railroad to enter the state of Nebraska. And in 1889, one of their reports said that they saw no reason to ever come to Lincoln because they didn't think enough freight would ever be developed here for them to build a track. But in 1892, they did build a line from Omaha to Lincoln and became the last major railroad to enter the city of Lincoln as well. But when they came in 1892, there were no land grants available within the city. They're going to have a straight line come in which parallels Adams Street. But when they get to about 17th or 18th Street, 18th Street to the north, they're going to have to start buying lots. And they will buy a grid of lots which follow a rather serpentine effect through the city of Lincoln, because there just aren't lots open in a straight line, which they would have loved. But if you could look down on what's now that Rock Island bike trail, you can see that it does not follow a complete straight line. And if we look at the lots underneath it, we'll find that that railroad track runs, in some cases, right through the middle of a lot. Sometimes they will have 3 parallel lots they had to purchase, and they'll run along one extreme edge of one of them as a mosaic, if you will, running through the city of Lincoln. The depot itself on the left is considered French chateau-esque, and it's made of Colorado red sandstone and a great deal of red pressed brick. It has a very sharply pitched slate roof and an 8-foot radius bay which extends out. Railroad stations, depots always had that so that the guy sitting there could look up and down the track. There were also ladies' lavatories, a smoking room, and a ticket office on the 15-foot tall ground floor, and then above it were the quarters for the station agent. And up on a tablet, you can just barely see it in this picture, was a Chicago, Rock Island, Pacific motif of their sort of trademark, if you will. The other thing that when I was a kid I remember was that just to the right in this picture of the locomotive is a little bit of an island, sort of a triangular shaped island, and a rather wise entrepreneur in Lincoln probably leased but perhaps bought that tract of land, and he then set up what was called Trax, T-R-A-X Oil Company. And he would buy a train car full of gasoline, pull it onto a siding there, and sell gasoline to the retail public. A gas station, if you will, where literally the gas came out of that car. Whether there was an intermediate tank or not, I'm not sure. But of course, the fire marshal didn't like that very well. But it also was one of the first times we had major gas wars in the city of Lincoln when Trax was located there. Well, the Rock Island had its own problems, and in 1915 it reorganized for the first time in a bankruptcy situation. In 1925, the city of Lincoln had a brilliant idea. Why don't we have a Union Railroad station in Lincoln, which would serve all of the railroads? And their idea was to form yet a new, to replace the 1894 viaduct over the tracks on O Street. And from that viaduct, they would build a roadway to the north, which would connect to the second floor of a Union station, which you would then go down. And if you think of Omaha, their Burlington station and their Union Pacific station, this is the way they built, off of a viaduct, and you would go down a floor to be at the track level. And it seemed like a great idea. Union Pacific and Burlington were somewhat interested in it, but the Missouri Pacific, Chicago Northwestern, and the Rock Island had nothing to gain. It would have cost them a fortune to try and find enough trackage to connect to the downtown depot. And also, what would they do with what they had here? I don't think they were the least bit interested in it. And so the 1925 concept of a Union Station completely failed. And then when the current Burlington Station building was built, the cost of that was shared with the Union Pacific. So that comes as close to a Union Station as we're ever going to have. That was 1927. Now, the Rock Island had about 25 on-grade railroad crossings in the city of Lincoln alone. So it would have worked for them in that instance. And one of the things I remember, I think the next picture will show it, was at on-grade, they would, particularly if there was a great deal of congestion on the street, in this case it's O Street, they would put a man in a little shack. In this case, the shack is on stilts. It's probably about 10 feet in the air. We're looking down O Street towards the east in this picture. We're standing literally on the tracks, or maybe just a little west of them. And he operated a series of levers up in that elevated shack. And you can also see the arms of a crossing. So by operating these levers, he could cause the crossings to come down and stop O Street traffic. If you went to N Street or P Street, you would find a little shack about that size or maybe a little smaller with a man sitting inside it with a stop sign. And when the train was coming, he would run out and stop traffic with a stop sign. And this was certainly in the 40s when I was a kid. I can remember this guy running out with his sign. So this would have been a good reason, too, for them to join in the central idea, but they did not. In October of 1966, the lack of passenger train traffic caused them to close the depot itself. And at that point in time, Clark and Anderson will redesign the building as a bank for the City National Bank, and it has been a bank ever since. Supposedly that conversion, which has been written up in a great many restoration articles, was the first such conversion of a depot to a bank in the United States. Who knows for sure? 1980, they were again bankrupt, and in 1984 was the last day of operation for freight on the Rock Island and the City of Lincoln. So it completely closed down. Almost nothing remains today of the Rock Island yards or Rock Island and Lincoln at all. For a long time, there was a derelict signal at about 18th and Y, something like that. Maybe a few pieces of track embedded in brick pavement around the city. Some of them have been paved over, but not much remains at all of the Rock Island and Lincoln. This is a building which was directly across P Street to the north from the freight depot, and this was a freight house. Now, the freight house connects to the Rock Island's switching yard in the city of Lincoln, which is not very extensive. It's directly to north of this building. Ultimately, this building and the buildings adjacent to it, which were owned by the Rock Island, will be purchased by the university, first by a lumberyard, I should say. And then that lumberyard is purchased by the University of Nebraska, and it becomes what they called a commissary, where incoming goods were kept for, like the chemistry department or any other department that had incoming things. Then that was torn down, and now the university is building dormitories and other buildings in that site as well. But the switching yard, the switching yard, which was north of that, was mostly owned by the OL&B Railroad, because the OL&B, don't let this picture confuse you, I'm still talking about the Chicago Rock Island. The switching that would go from one railroad to another was controlled and owned by the OL&B, Omaha, Lincoln, and Beatrice Railroad. So if a train car came in on the Union Pacific and you wanted to transfer it to go out on the Rock Island, the OL&B switch engine would move it into their yard, which in fact was directly to the north of that building. So the OL&B was the transfer point between all of them. Now, we're back on O Street here. This is 15th and O Streets. We're looking at the southeast corner of the intersection. Again, a building which I remember quite vividly. Very skinny building, a half a block long. We're looking at the west elevation of the building, so we're looking towards the southeast. We can see that it appears to be held up by the one-story Sun Theater, which is next to it on the left. It looks like if a good wind came along, it might just blow that building over. Okay, well, the original plat of the city of Lincoln went only to 17th Street because they felt that south of O Street, beyond 17th Street, a new city would develop to be called East Lincoln. Well, Lincoln developed so quickly to the east and to the south that it simply overran any possibility of that, and before you knew it, it went all the way to 27th Street. So this block would have been right on the edge of the city, and as late as 1885, the block was literally empty and didn't even have houses on it at that point in time. There was one little building on the corner, which was a fence manufacturer, and there had been a few houses on it, but not much. This is block 60, if you like to keep track what block we're in. In 1880, a man by the name of David L. Brace moved to Lincoln from Illinois, and he took a rented room on Q Street between 13th and 14th Street. He became the manager of a company which was selling Bibles primarily. And the way they sold Bibles was to get you to sign up for a Bible, and they would imprint your name in gold on the front cover. So he was literally, that man, Mr. Brace, was literally a door-to-door Bible salesman. However, he went on into form an insurance agency with a man by the name of Strawbridge. Then in 1887, he was president of the Nebraska Realty Company and even gave the city of Lincoln 6 acres of land to be used as a park. He platted Lincoln Heights. Lincoln Heights was north of the city of Lincoln and can be thought of as part of Belmont and West Lincoln. Went towards the north. Lincoln Heights did not develop, and at that point neither did Belmont, so he didn't make a great deal of money out of that. Now we're going to look at another man by the name of I.M. Raymond. In 1885, he noticed that there were many fire insurance companies in the area, and that if a farmer, for example, had a claim on his property, it could be months before it was settled. And he felt this was not good and that you should be able to settle any fire insurance claim within a matter of a few days, and even in many cases in a matter of a few hours. So he started the Farmers and Merchants Insurance Company, capitalized for $100,000, and he was above the Opera House at 12th and O Streets. That was on the southwest corner of that intersection. They offered policies for fire, lightning, and tornadoes, and they advertised that these policies would be free from ambiguous and vexatious clauses. As an attorney, I don't see how you wouldn't think that could ever be done. I don't think vexatious clauses are part of every insurance policy. Well, they promised to pay every insurance claim within 24 hours of a loss, and they also had a disclaimer in there that they could take as long as 3 or 4 days if there were extenuating circumstances, but certainly much less than the 2 or 3 months before. The firm became very profitable very quickly. By 1891. The firm was headed by Donald E. Thompson, and I want Matt to notice that I did not call him David Thompson, but Donald Thompson, who was a land agent for the Burlington and Missouri River Railroad. He also established the Lincoln Star newspaper. He was president of the Lincoln Gas Company, the Aurora State Bank, Lincoln Electric Light Company, and the Capital National Bank. In 1889, the state of Nebraska purchased his mansion to become the first official residence for the governor, or the first governor's mansion. Unfortunately, the farmers and merchants' treasurer was a man by the name of C.W. Mosier, who was responsible for primarily the failure of the Capital National Bank in 1893 and ended up getting free lunches in the federal prison. So Mr. Mosier, the company is going to go down. In 1890, the David Brace Realty Company, going back to Mr. Brace, purchased the southeast corner of 15th and O Streets, the area we're talking about right here. We don't know what he paid for it, but he later reported that it was worth the property $30,000. I doubt it, not quickly, but at any rate, he did build the half-long block building, which cost $70,000 and was called originally the Brace Building. The insurance company that had been in there moved to the Burr Block at 12th and O Street, which is the building that is still there on the northeast corner of the building. At that point in time, he claimed to have 20 men working for the insurance company and 5 men in the field. Now he's going to have an insurance office in this building as well, and he will occupy 2 floors pretty much in the building. Then in 1899, the top floor of the building, which is the 5th floor of the building, will be leased to the Lincoln Dental College. The Lincoln Dental College was under the direction of Dr. Davis, who was an MD and a DDS. Classrooms and offices were up there as well. We're looking probably in this photograph towards the windows which would have faced the west. And you can see that they also had an elaborate system of electric lights. They were right up to date. Briefly, this dental college partnered with Cotner University, located in Bethany at that time. They furnished science classes and so forth. That didn't last very long, and the privately owned dental college offered to sell to the University of Nebraska. The University of Nebraska could not afford it. That was in 1903, so they continued to operate. And they will move from here into the Lansing, Liberty, Oliver, Varsity Theater building, and they will occupy the upper floor there for a long time, and in fact, World War I. And in 1918, the federal government urged the University of Nebraska to start a school of dentistry, and they will, at that point in time, finally purchase the school, the privately owned school, and it will become part of the University of Nebraska. Now, the next use of the building comes about when a man by the name of G.W. Montgomery starts the Farmers and Merchants Bank in the Farmers and Merchants Insurance Company building, or the Brace building. Within a short time, they noted that they were paying 4% interest on saving. That's a lot better than we can do today, 4%. And then in the early 20s, it became the Nebraska State Bank building, but that failed in the Great Depression. So then the building became known as the Nebraska State Building. Ultimately, it became Federated Finance, which is a name which many of you will remember. By the 1950s, Federated Finance occupied most of the first floor of the building, and there were a dozen very small buildings and offices upstairs. But the building at that point in time will be torn down and become a parking lot, just a skinny little parking lot for, across the street to the west, the DLD Hotel, sometimes called the Milner Hotel. And though that was just a very small 3-story hotel, which was on the alley directly to the north of the YWCA, and it is now gone as well. One of many photographs taken from the dome of the Capitol building. In this case, we are looking, of course, towards the northwest over downtown Lincoln, and begin to see a few buildings which we'll recognize as extant today. The immediate building on the right-hand side is the Christian Church building. In this picture, it is uncompleted, and of course it will be barely completed by the Christian Church in time for them to go bankrupt. The building will sit empty for a while, be purchased ultimately by the Roman Catholic Church, who will remodel the building after a fire, causing the roof lines to change a little bit, and they'll add the very tall spire on the corner. But that building, for all intents and purposes, is still there. Across the street to the left is the site of the Baptist Church, First Baptist Church. It had originally been located in Lincoln at about 11th and L, something like that. And they had sold that property, purchased this nearly 1/4 block area, and built this red brick building in there, which has also now been raised and replaced with a stone building. So this is the second site of the First Baptist Church, and also the second Baptist Church to sit on that site. But it's the second site of the First Baptist Church. So it's the third church of the First Baptist Church in Lincoln, which has now been replaced by the fourth church of the First Baptist Church on the second site. Right? Okay, I think that's right. Now to the left of that, we see another church building. This is the Swedish Lutheran Church, which is a tiny little parcel in this picture, which we will watch through the years become an apartment house and ultimately a parking lot. It was part of the property. It was given to it by the state of Nebraska, and their property went all the way to 13th Street, but they will sell off the corner, which first thing we'll remember there is Trixie's IGA, which will later become the law offices, Providence Savings and Loan, and then law offices as well. We can see other churches in there. That's the original Roman Catholic Church building in the city of Lincoln. They still own the property underneath it. It was given to them in 1867 by the Capital Commission. They own the property underneath it, but it's been leased out to a consortium of downtown businessmen back in the 1970s, 1980s for a 2- or 3-story glass-fronted parking lot. To the left, we can see two church buildings. The one on the right is First Presbyterian. This is their second site in the city of Lincoln. And on the left of it is the First Congregational site. And we can also see behind it what is now St. Paul Methodist Church, which we'll be talking about very briefly. 1881, we can also see the Burr Block, which still stands at 12th and O Street, has had a couple of floors added to it and a very interesting conversion. And just to the right of that, on the horizon, we can see the original building of the University of Nebraska, long gone. In 1881, the population of Lincoln was approximately 48,000. There were 200 miles of streets in the city of Lincoln, 5.5 of which were paved. There were 329 street names in the city of Lincoln, which means that a lot of those streets would go for a block or 2 or 3 and change their names, and go for a block or 2 and 3 and change their names. Most of those were systematized, but we still have streets like the first street north of South Street is Plum Street, Cable Street, Sailor Street. It's got about 5 names through the years. There were also 38 churches extant in the city of Lincoln in 1888. There were 13 temperance unions and 30 saloons to offset them. St. Paul United Methodist Church. First church services in Lincoln were undoubtedly, or in Lancaster County rather, were Methodist driven. Probably a man by the name of Reverend Zenas Turman, who is a circuit rider for 7 counties in Nebraska and a missionary church, and traveled around. The first church service that was recorded by him was on Salt Creek near Olathe. Olathe is very close to, Roca. It's just about a half a mile west of Roca. In other words, it's plowed ground today. That was in 1857, so well before statehood. But Methodists were coming in at that point in time. The first sermon preached in Lincoln was probably by Elder J.M. Young in 1863. And he had his sermon in W.W. Cox's residence. This is James Young, who lives here's great-grandfather, I think. Jim will let me know if I haven't got enough greats in there. It's either great or great-great-grandfather. I think it was a great-grandfather. So settlement of Lancaster, you will remember, was owned by the Methodist Church. This was the Methodist Protestant Church at that time. So you would think the Methodist Protestants owning the city of Lancaster would have been responsible for the first Methodist church and the first church in the city. But that's not the case. The first church in the city of Lancaster and transferring over to Lincoln was the Congregational Church. The Congregational Church was called the Lancaster Congregational Church. They met, however, in the Methodist Protestant Female Seminary building. Now, the reason this becomes complicated is the fact that this was the Methodist Protestant Church. And the way it was established had criteria. You could not establish a church, in quotation marks, without a certain number of members. You had to start as what they called a Methodist Sunday school, which is what they established. Then when you reached a certain larger number, you could become a Methodist station. Then as that number increased, you could ultimately become a church. So this enabled the Congregational Church, who didn't live by those rules, to start their church in the city before the Methodists could organize a church. It's a technicality, but Congregationalists like to call attention to that. So, the first land given to the Methodist Church will be on the block that we now think of as the Lincoln Journal block. And if you know where the parking garage is on the northeast corner of that block, and if you go around to the P Street side of it, you'll see a State of Nebraska State Historical Society plaque, which says Lincoln's founding block. Now, the church itself faced towards the east on 10th Street, probably right at or just on that corner, but perhaps one lot to the south, but right there. Just a tiny little frame building. And the first minister to serve that building was a man by the name of H.T. Davis, who started as a circuit minister, but then became the first one assigned to the Lancaster class by that point in time. He arrived in 1868, and he discovered that that little frame building still wasn't completed at that point in time. So one of the daughters of one of his parishioners, a young girl, said she referred to it as the Methodist Church with the latest improvement, which proved to be a $400 mortgage. And that takes us within 5 minutes of where we want to end today. So the rest of this story is long enough that we will pick it up in our next session and tell the rest of the story of what starts as First Methodist Church and ultimately through the years will become St. Paul Methodist Church. And we have the First Methodist Church in Lincoln today, but it is in University Place, not in Lincoln. And we'll see why that happened a bit later. So we will pause now and see if there are any questions. And usually there are. Make up one, Chris. We got 5 minutes. There we go. Roxanne.
What was that Congregational Church?
The Lancaster, it was called originally. The church, she asked what was the name of that church, and what is ultimately going to become First Plymouth Congregational Church will be the Lancaster Congregational Church. And not next time, but maybe the time after that, we'll look at the Congregational Church and how it went through those changes as well, and I'll give you that in detail. Okay? Another question?
What year was the Farmers Merchant Bank building torn down?
The question is, what year was the Farmers and Merchants Bank, when
When was that building torn down for the?
1957.
50s?
57, 58, yeah. Okay, that was that skinny building on 15th and O. Of course, there is no 15th and O anymore.
No.
Now it's Centennial. Oh, okay, right. Another question? If not, I'm not sure when we will meet again, but it won't be next month. I think you have a plan already stated for that. So stand by, and a postcard will be forthcoming. Thank you very much.